Yeah, we got some people coming in. Hi, everyone. Welcome. Awesome. So hopefully you're in the right place. This is the Project Wild session, and you're going to hear from Allie Thomas. So I will hand it over to Allie so she can start us off and we can get going here.
Sounds good. Hi, everyone. My name is Allie Thomas, and I am the Director of the Outreach Division for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. And I also happen to be the State Coordinator of the Project Wild Curriculum Guide series. So that's what I'm here to chat about with you today. I'll give you a little bit of background of myself, and especially in relation to Project Wild. And I will give you some background information about Project Wild from a national level, because I know we're not all from Vermont in the room. If at any point you have a question, just use the raise your hand function, type it in the chat. I'm not going to wait till the end to answer questions. So please, even if you just unmute yourself, because I can't see everyone, and just say, I have a question, that's perfectly fine. But like I said, I'm going to start kind of from the beginning of P Wild, so there's a background understanding of where this is all coming from. But again, my name is Allie, and I have worked for the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department in the Outreach Division since 2011. And although I'm the director of the division now, the majority of my time in the department has been as an education manager and in the education programs in particular. So doing things like social media and press releases and other communications are newer for me. My roots are all in education, and that's what I practice often still. I have an undergraduate degree in geology and environmental sciences from Minnesota, a small school in Minnesota, where I'm from. And then I worked for the United States Forest Service in northern Minnesota as an interpreter, the Park Service as an interpreter in northern Minnesota. I worked in public schools for a couple years with unique learners, and I in both very, very urban setting and very, very, very rural settings. And then I mostly have been a naturalist and educator in my career. I got my graduate degree from Wisconsin in Stevens Point, and I worked for the Wisconsin DNR as an educator and environmental technician in a wildlife management area. So that's my background, and I think I like to mention that just because one of the reasons forever I've loved Project Wild and have used it often, and I'll describe how we use it in our department in particular, is because it's like the real deal, as educators, you know how sometimes you'll read a curriculum and you're like, ooh, whoever wrote this never hung out with 14-year-olds before. Like, that's not the case with this. This is the real deal. This is created by people who often are agency, Fish and Wildlife Agency, sometimes Extension Service people, but staff who have a very solid background and often education and experience as biologists or natural resource professionals, but they're also educators on some level, whether formal or informal. So it really melds both of those worlds. Project Wild in general is it's a supplemental resource series of guides to help people insert wildlife education into whatever type of curriculum they're doing. And it's an international program, actually, that was originally run by an organization called the Council for Environmental Education. And that was out of Texas, and it started in 1983. And it was really a result of people who are practicing in the field of environmental education, which in a very modern sense started in the 70s. And they were like, why aren't school teachers doing environmental ed? It's like such a great topic, such a good thing, so important. And the issue was there were no curriculums that were relevant and easy to use, whether or not a teacher was like in a concrete jungle in the center of New York City, or a beautiful little rural New England school. And so they created this guide in hopes really to be more equitable about providing good environmental education on a place-based level for everybody, and provide something easy for teachers to use. Certainly since 1983, it has been revised multiple times, and I'll talk about those revisions a bit, but correlated to standards. Some states have their very own specific standards, how Project Wild addresses the state standards. Other states like Vermont don't. I've never done a specific state education standard correlation because ours are so close to the next generation science standards on a national level. But some states have standards that are not like NGSS. And so those states have correlated them separately. I just never have because it would be repetitive. Now, PWild is administered by the Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies that is located out of Washington, D.C. It still functions the same way. We have a series of state coordinators all over the country. And most of the time, and in most states, there are whole networks of facilitators who provide training to educators. Whether those educators are formal or informal educators, whether they work at like a nature center, a museum, or they're a 7th grade science teacher, they're, or a paraprofessional after school. After school is actually a really big, for me, a really big group of, part of the group that I train often. But these coordinators facilitate facilitation networks, and then they provide training. Now, if you're from Vermont, and in Vermont, it's me. I'm the coordinator and the facilitator for this state. Sometimes I have like a professor or two at certain universities or colleges that also are a facilitator, and they provide it to maybe their pre-service educators. But the ones I had all retired. So it's much much more home-based in Vermont than in a lot of other states, but we still certify a lot of educators every year. And we utilize the guides a ton in our conservation education, especially in our department. So that's kind of the really big broad background. When I say there's a suite of resources with Project Wild, what I'm referring to is different guides that have been created over the years. The original guide was a K-12 terrestrial guide, which is still being used. It's been modified a lot. The most recent printing of it was 2018. But we also have a Spanish version. We have, in some states that have herds of elk, especially reintroduced herds of elk, there's a Wild About Elk guide. Flying Wild is another really kind of almost different, and it's set up differently, and I'll talk about that guide that is available through trainings as well. And then in like 2010, we started working on a young children's guide, like a preschool version, ages 3 through 7. Because, as I'm sure a lot of you, if not all of you, are educators. And as you know, from a developmental standpoint, kindergarten curriculum is really irrelevant for pre-K oftentimes, depending on exactly the age of the pre-K and exactly your elementary school that you teach. And so there's so much brain development and important social and emotional learning that happens as a early childhood educator knows. And so they said, we need to make a guide specifically for that pre-K audience. And that's how Growing Up Wild was created. That has been one of my most popular guides to provide trainings for, because daycare educators love it. Again, I'll go through this guide closer as I talk more, but they have a lot of professional development they have to do to maintain their licensure every year. So it was nice to get trained in a guide that they can immediately the next day start using with their, whether it's daycare or preschool kids, or quite honestly, growing up wild is often more relevant for after school, like if it's after school in an elementary school, than even the K through 12 guide, because it's a little bit looser. There's a lot more physical components to it, body and music and movement and singing and dancing, artistic expression, which are things by 3 o'clock everybody's ready to use a little bit more than a typical classroom-based curriculum. So the Growing Up Wild Guide definitely has a hard start at age 3. Anything earlier and it's a stretch. But the high end of the age bracket to me has no end. I've used it, I don't tell people this, but I've definitely used it on adults, some of the programs, because like I said, everybody likes to boogie and there's a lot of good music and movement in it, and it helps remember really fundamental concepts in wildlife conservation and science. So AFWA, that's what we call it. What I love about this guide, and it really becomes apparent as you thumb through any of the guides, the activities that are there, is it's not teaching you what to think. Like this is right, this is wrong, it's black and white, good or bad. Not at all. It's teaching you how to think, which is absolutely the premise of wildlife management. There's economics, there's social aspects, there's human dimensions, and then there's a whole bunch of natural resources science, and it all gets smushed together when making decisions. And you know, those decisions are a moving target and it changes and the factors change all the time. And so what we want to teach students who are, whether they're 3 or 45 in the Project Wild courses, is that wildlife management and land conservation and water conservation are constantly evolving and developing, and they include as much human and cultural perspectives as they do scientific. And understanding to really balance those and take them all into consideration is essential. And so the goal of this guide is to really just develop an awareness and build up from awareness to knowledge, skills, and hopefully some action, just to, you know, make decisions with wildlife, land conservation, and water conservation in mind down the road. In my experience as an educator, and I teach as many adults as kids every year, and it's in the thousands, pretty much everyone's almost at awareness and fundamental knowledge still. You know, life is busy, there's a lot going on, and few people have, you know, especially kids and youth in schools, have a ton of skills related to analyzing environmental issues quite yet. And so this guide does a really great job of taking them through that in a very organic way that is place-based and relevant, so it doesn't feel like a stretch. It's just kind of sneaky education is the best way to say it. It's interesting, it's fun, it's relevant. Oh shoot, I did math and science today, but I just mostly had fun. I've had kids get mad at me before because they're like, did you just teach me math? As mentioned, there's multiple guides that we have available, but if you kind of boiled them all down, what would sugar off is the idea of wildlife conservation, land conservation, and habitat conservation. Conservation is not preservation. It's not don't touch, don't play, don't be part of. It's an extreme interaction with humans and the wild environment. It's an understanding or a thought process that humans are as much a part of nature as anything else, and the way in which they interact with it hopefully is gentle, but it doesn't mean no touch, no play. And these guides do a great job of trying to inspire that type of relationship with people of all different ages. As I mentioned, in Vermont, it's me, and then I'm also the facilitator, but in most states, they have really robust facilitator networks. I saw, if there are people from Illinois here, an amazing network of facilitators throughout the state. Texas has an amazing, tons of states have amazing facilitator networks. I'm just a small state, and it's just the way we've done it has kept it pretty simple. But again, we use it often and certainly reach a lot of educators every year. Every single guide, whether it's the terrestrial guide, the aquatic guide, Flying Wild, Growing Up Wild, every single guide is very hands-on. It's interdisciplinary. It will tell you in matrices in the back or appendices in the back, it'll say, there might be like a table and it says, if you want to do lower elementary, these are the activities for lower elementary, upper elementary, these activities. Or it sometimes separates it by skill sets. Are you looking to enhance your interpretation of data, your analysis of data, or looking at topics like biodiversity, ecosystems, evolution, land conservation, land management. So it sets all of the different activities can be searched and utilized based on categories, but they're all interdisciplinary. Just because you're doing an activity about land use management and planning and where you're going to put houses and shopping mall and a forest and a school or whatever the activity, there's going to be math in it. There's going to be science. There's going to probably be some writing or language arts. Some activities emphasize disciplines more than others. And so in those activities, they're going to be categorized as this is mostly an environmental ed and math activity. But again, it's a little bit of everything. And I think that's a very organic way to teach. And it's also a little bit more relevant for the learner, and it makes it just feel like there are ways to connect with the curriculum a little bit easier. And therefore that's where the sneakiness like sticks in. Like there's all these opportunities for people to relate it to their real life. Again, I've used it in formal schools all the time, but through our conservation education programs in the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department, which are all non-formal education programs, whether it be an aquatic resource ed program, fishing, hunter education, trapper education, our conservation camps that we host in the summertime, we have so much Project Wild we've integrated and modified and use just like it's part of our curriculum for always. But it originated and has roots all in the Project Wild guides and the activities created there. It is standards-based, like I mentioned. Sometimes that means nothing to people, whether they're formal or non-formal educator. They're like, I can do whatever I want. Sometimes educators live and die by standards, and they have to address them. The beauty is these guides are always correlated to the national standards, and if state standards are vastly different, often correlated to that as well. And if you go to the Project Wild website, just Google it, those are all listed out, and it tells you. The beauty of having people write this curriculum who first and foremost are natural resource professionals is that it is scientifically accurate. There's not myths in there, but it also means that it really emphasizes the scientific process in the fact that there's a lot of unknowns. It's when I say scientifically accurate, it's not like, well, this is the answer because it's science. A lot of times in science, the answer is like, well, depends on how you look at it, or depends on who you're asking. And that's that beautiful nuance that I think if we can teach early, really helps learners develop an empathy for other viewpoints, and also just that idea of collaboration of thoughts and ideas are really important when decision making, and it's not made in a vacuum and done in a vacuum. Nor in science isn't like that. And I think sometimes it gets this interesting reputation that like everything's in a lab and then they decide and then that's how it happens and works, and that's not the case. And so it's very well done from a scientific perspective. I often work with colleges and universities to provide this training to pre-service educators, especially like gym, PE, college professors, physical education. They like it when we come in because it is such a great way to spiral core curriculum with a lot of physical movement and long-term life skills. So we have the Aquatic Wild Guide, which is about all things water through the lens of wildlife. And we have gym teachers who are like, dude, let's bring this guide into our school and we're going to teach fly fishing and spin cast fishing because those are super fun. Kids are going to get totally into it, but we're going to sneak this guide in there. And we're also going to talk about things like macroinvertebrates and water quality and ecosystem services and erosion and land use practices that affect water quality. And so it's like, this really amazing interdisciplinary moment that integrates math and science and language arts and movement, and they can do it all in their gym class. That's one example, but it is often we work with pre-service educators, and again, PE teachers, but also all pre-service, especially elementary and middle school too, because they're more interdiscipline. I'm going to keep moving on here, but I would be remiss to not mention that this does have a STEM component. Every activity has what's called In Step with STEM, and it says how that activity relates to STEM, but even more so, if you really want to emphasize the STEM, it gives you additional ideas how to, whatever the activity may be, with, you know, a title and goals and objectives and materials and a procedure. And it's like, but if you want to do even more STEM, this is how you can, and relate it to this specific activity, which is cool. And there's, I will say, especially with the younger guide, there's a lot of STEAM going on because there's just so much art, especially in how they assess the learners, because like nowhere in P Wild is there a bubble sheet, like, you know, a test with pen and paper at the end of it, but definitely in the Growing Up Wild guide, a lot of the assessment is like music and movement or acting out or doing a skit, to kind of recap what they learned. But that is also in the upper level guide as well. Yeah, for early childhood educators, the NAEYC standards are in there, as well as the Head Start standards. So that's pretty cool. But for the P Wild, the K through 12 guides, again, they're all correlated to NGSS. NAAEE is a funky acronym, but it stands for the North American Association for Environmental Education. And NAAEE has guidelines for learning, and this correlates to those conceptual frameworks that are kind of like best management practices. That also correlates to how the Boy and Girl Scout badges, or the Scout badges in general. So it certainly is field tested and, you know, aligned with, if it matters to teachers or non-formal educators, it is here. It's all aligned to those standards. The K through 12 guides, whether it be the aquatic guide or the terrestrial, both set up in the same way, in that it begins, the first third of it begins at like just the foundation of ecological knowledge, right? Awareness and knowledge. And that's kind of like the building blocks of learning, and certainly addresses the goals of environmental education in general. But P Wild is the idea of, let's build awareness and knowledge first, and then we'll get to these ideas that are a little bit more multidisciplinary and draw in more economics and social sciences and political sciences. Right now, let's figure out what an ecosystem is, right? Let's figure out what a habitat is. It is amazing how often I'll work with adults, and this isn't me making fun, this is just an observation. I work with adults and I'll say, okay, what's a habitat? And they'll give me great examples of very specific things, but the definition of a habitat, right? Food, water, shelter, space, that's a big one. And oftentimes wildlife agencies are charged with wildlife habitat. That's a lot, you know, for microorganisms up to moose. And so we unpack that concept of diversity even within those terms we use every day, and what a big lift that is, and how we can unpack all the different parts and pieces of those big terms. So it doesn't, you know, it definitely addresses the basics that are necessary in a really interesting and engaging way. It's not boring, it's not basic, it's often very hands-on, and really gets to concepts that you hear all the time, that when asked in isolation what they mean can be hard to define, and this does a great job of doing that for the learners. And it does that in the first third of the books. Then it kind of scoots over into the social and political realm, just the idea of the way we manage the environment is largely based on social structures and our social capacity to handle things like wildlife being near our homes, and our social capacity to handle the way in which maybe natural resources, rivers, impact our lives on a daily basis. The way in which we develop the landscape or don't develop it or zone it or don't zone it. So that's when all of this starts coming in, because you can't manage wildlife without understanding the social and political knowledges as well. And so it's a really neat opportunity for the participants to start getting a very interdisciplinary look at how humans interact and regulate the environment. And in our case, it's wildlife. This is really where some amazing opportunities through the activities start to happen, because it starts to give youth voice, like an amplifier. Like it lets them speak and have their ideas, and instead of being like, well, that's wrong because this is the answer, because there's no right and wrong answer, it's like, that's interesting, where does that come from? Oh, your family is your whole life for 7 generations lived here and hunted, fished, and trapped. That's cool. And then someone else might have a totally different viewpoint because they recently moved from a place that was completely urban. Whatever, I'm making this up, but you get the idea that it like gives these kids an opportunity to have opinions and to take information and synthesize it and analyze it and communicate about it. But then listen to other people's attitudes. And of course, it takes, good facilitation, and hopefully, most teachers are great at that anyway. And through the training, this is a good opportunity to work on that. But definitely, it takes facilitation when you have multiple viewpoints that are often very emotional, because they're associated with lifestyles and the environment, and people, how their families behave and how they grew up or how they act now. But that's like wonderful to practice with youth, to practice these situations where it's okay to disagree, and it's okay to be really fired up about something and disagree with someone and still like them and still be kind to them. And it has so many amazing opportunities in the guide to do that, all through the lens of wildlife, which is an easy sell because everybody has an opinion of wildlife. Like whether they're like, ew, gross, I don't like it, or like, yeah, we hunted for 17 generations in my family, or I want to be a wildlife photographer someday. Like everybody has some sort of connection. Like, yeah, I see deer when I go to school, or we feed the birds in my backyard. So the hook is there, it's natural, and you don't even need to use it to get them. It's just inherent to their interest. But the way in which information is shared and ideas are shared is where this guide helps you facilitate it very well. And finally, it's the section where we focus on sustaining fish and wildlife resources. So this is where like decisions are made. A lot of times I'll go into high school technical centers, like whether it's forestry or agriculture, or I've done auto shop, but usually it's forestry or agriculture. And we'll do a lesson in there called checks and balances. And we learn all about like wildlife management, and we talk about deer herd management, just because deer in Vermont and many places are important, and people are very emotional about them. And we are going to manage the herd, and it has this great game where it's like a board game, and there's dice, and they're making decisions, they're making management decisions based on like, the weather was like this, so what are you going to do to the herd, and what are you going to do during the spring, summer, fall, and winter? And it's just such a neat opportunity with a ton of scaffolding, a ton of background information to provide, so everybody is set up for success in this. And success doesn't mean the right answer, but it means being able to do the game, participate, and leave knowing things like, oh, wildlife populations are super dynamic, and there's not one variable that makes them good, bad, or otherwise. It might be climate, it might be weather, it might be land use practices, it might be disease. There's so many things that go into it. But instead of just leaving being like, well, that's confusing and hard, they're like, but it's manageable. Like if we work together and we look at all of these things, the students have success. And it's really cool to go into tech centers. Sometimes, not always, but sometimes in tech centers, especially some of them, the students don't love traditional classroom spaces. And so they're more drawn to like, I'm doing the forestry program, so I can go learn how to do timber harvest and build homes, which is so cool. And we go in and we teach this, and they leave being like, oh, I just did math and science. I worked in a small group. We took into account the historical land use practices of the state of Vermont. Um, we talked about how laws are passed and how regulations are passed. And I did it all, and I participated and I did well. And that's huge. And this book does that in a very sneaky way and fun way. Every activity in any of the guides, not just the K through 12 terrestrial, aquatic, flying wild, all of them are set up the same way, which is lovely, right? As educators, it's like we don't need to be like figure out what is where every time. You open the guide and you're like, okay, I'm going to play the thicket game today. Well, I know exactly the grade level. I will say though, as a non-formal educator, if I'm going to not pay attention to any of the guidelines, it's the grade level. I can pretty much modify. I know what I want to teach. I'll deal with like how I modify it to be appropriate to the grade level. But it is in there, which is very nice. It always has the objectives. There's a small background section. Thicket game is a really pretty straightforward game. So the background section is just that paragraph or two, but typically it's a little bit more hardy. So as an educator, like the number one barrier for educators bringing kids outside over and over again shows and studies. I'm not a naturalist. I don't know all the answers. Who cares? Like just go out and try. And the background does help answer most questions that kids would ask in relation to, or any participants would ask in relation to the activity. So, you know, it gets old after a while being like, I don't know, let's go inside and learn together the answer. Like after, it's nice to know a few answers, and that background section certainly will set you up for that kind of success. As you can see, there's always content areas that are emphasized in each lesson, as well as methods, materials, activity time. In the Growing Up Wild, there's like wild, wacky word. What is it called? Wild words. It's like a cute way to say vocabulary, but there's always these correlations. Again, it ties to the conceptual framework, gives you terms to know, vocab. And of course, it ties you to which appendices are relevant for that game. Instead of having to like, and this is like making me sound so old, but like go to the copier machine and copy student pages, there are PDFs for every student page online. So you just print from the online resource and the appendices are huge. Like as a non-formal educator, especially after school educators, I've found they have this section, well, actually formal too, but they have this section in the back where it's like unit ideas. And it gives you, I think, a 6 and 8 week unit idea. So if you're an after school educator, or you're like a 7th grade educator in LA and social studies, and your team teacher is math and science, and you're like, okay, for 8 weeks, we're doing a unit on biodiversity. Let's look at the lessons that they have listed in the biodiversity unit that are applicable to middle school. And I'll take the LA and social ones, and you take the ones that emphasize in math and science. And you will be spiraling this great curriculum with your team teacher, but never duplicating a lesson in particular. The kids won't, they'll just be like, oh, wait a minute, that's related to this and this and this. That's crazy. And it's just a really like exciting way for kids to learn, because they'll go into language arts and be like, wait, we're going to write about habitats? That's science. And then they know the answers. And then it's just like really exciting. So all of them are set up in the same activity format, which is great. Really briefly, the 2018 edition was one of the most heavily revised versions in years and years that we created. It has a lot more focus on pollinators, on climate change, and on phenology, the study of the changing seasons and how the Earth responds to changing seasons at different latitudes. Certainly a greater diversity of topics in general. Human energy use is a big one. Like I mentioned, climate literacy, diseases is a big one, invasive species. And also it focused on a lot more different species. It wasn't like deer and elk. Not that the old ones are only that, but it does a better job of non-game species and pollinators and herps, reptiles and amphibians, and there's some really cool new activities in there with those. So that new guide is really quite phenomenal, because it is very relevant to the way we think and want to learn now. It has a very strong emphasis on what are called field investigations. So every lesson you could teach outside, but certainly some are conducive to like being in the classroom and others are conducive to getting outdoors. And so in the new guide, we made it a very strong effort to emphasize the activities that are great for field investigation. So a teacher can be like, okay, if you're in Vermont, it'll be like, I have 3.5 days without snow, sleet, or rain. So we're gonna do this lesson on those days or whatever it may be, but just to get outside. And so it's very, it differentiates the activities that are very good and conducive to outdoor field investigations. So as an educator, you can really plan on those opportunities to be outdoors. I mentioned In Step with STEM is in there. Also wild work. You know, a lot of schools starting in middle school even start to emphasize like, well, how in the world does this connect to like my job or a job someday? And the cool part about this is it's not like be a wildlife biologist, everyone. Like there's some that are like, well, be a lawyer if it's town planning, or be a graphic designer if it's PR work for an agency or whatever it may be. But it's very diverse wild work. It's not just everybody has to be a scientist. So that's always a fun way, a fun component to talk with kids about, because they might immediately think this doesn't relate to them because they're not into science. And this is a great way to show them there's so many careers associated with conservation that draw from all disciplines. The Aquatic Wild guide is the same thing. It's just all things water, right? It's wetlands, it's macro and micro invertebrates in stream, river, and lake systems. It does a great job, like the terrestrial guide, of kind of unpacking big issues in a really manageable way. For example, food systems. That's one of our biggest things when it comes to how we relate to the earth. And so they have sustainable seafood lesson where they track kind of where your food comes from. One of the things I love about Project Wild in general is there's no shaming in it. Like, yeah, they might have a lesson on food in it, but it's not going to be like, so now turn to your neighbor and if they have a plastic water bottle, like boo them. Like that's not how these work. It's just like, it recognizes sustainability is a journey, not a destination. And there are so many factors as to why people are at where they are in that journey, and nothing but respect and kindness is appropriate. And, you know, it's just the idea of let's get some more knowledge and maybe hopefully make decisions that are helpful in the future for sustainability. But we get you wherever you're at. That's cool. And we're glad you're here. So that's one thing I love about the guide is nobody feels bad, right, after participating in an activity, because that's like a drag. Again, In Step with STEM and wild work. And a lot of field investigations in this guide as well. A lot of opportunity to like get your feet wet, literally. And both guides have online resources. So you can go into the AFWA website and say, okay, I'm looking at Project Wild. I want to see all the sample activity. Or I want to connect with my state trainer and actually get trained so I can physically have this cool resource in my hands. Or I want the sheets associated with field investigation so I can just print them off and have them from here. Or I go into resources and in an alphabetical order based on the activity name, click on each activity and print off all the student pages associated with it. The Growing Up Wild guide also has a great website that has everything you'd ever want in it, organized by activity type. The cool thing about this one in particular is with early childhood educators, you know, they check in way more often with the parents, right, than like your 7th grade kids teachers do. It's like daily, like this is what we did at preschool today or whatever it may be. They have this cool, like with every activity in Growing Up Wild, I think there's 27 activities in it. They have this cool printout you can click on based on each activity, and it's home connections, and it's in both English and Spanish, and it tells the parent, the guardians of the child, what they did in school today, what they're learning, or usually it's a week, because like there's a lot of nap time and shoe tying, right? Like in snack time in any learning, but especially early childhood. So one activity is often stretched out over the course of a week. And And they can send these home connections to the parents and say, like, this is what your child's learning. If you want to spiral that curriculum or ask them questions or go do investigations on your own that support this, here are some activity ideas. Now, maybe like 1% of parents use those, but maybe not. And even just like having someone else write your daily report is kind of magical. So that's a really cool resource for early childhood educators. But this program, Growing Up Wild, is, oh my gosh, so fun. It's by far well, they're all my favorite. Whatever one I'm teaching is my favorite. But what I love about Growing Up Wild is like, it's just so artistic, and it really draws on a child's sense of wonder. Like, they're not too cool for school yet. If I'm a guest speaker in a preschool room, like, they immediately love me and I get invites to birthday parties. That does not happen in high school, right? And so like this guide builds on that. They're like, these kids are jazzed up, they're excited, they're happy, they're filled with curiosity. Not that high schoolers aren't, but it takes a little bit different angle to draw that out. This guide really builds on their sense of wonder, that idea to just explore things, and gives you a beautiful scaffolding to do it. So it's not just free play in the woods, which I'm a big fan of, but I also like objectives. I like lesson plans. I like assessments. I like doing all of that. And this guide really sets you up for that kind of success and that kind of organization. Okay, I have a little over 15 minutes, and there are chat items. Do people have questions? No, okay, good. I just want to make sure for a second. So with the Growing Up Wild guide, like I mentioned, the beginning age is 3, and I'm a hard believer that's no earlier. I've definitely been in front of like 50 people who've come to my workshop before. And when I ask, like, well, what age group do you work with in particular? And they're like, well, I'm in the infant room. Like, this is not for them. Like, this is not going to be relevant for the infant room. But for the 3-year-olds, it is 110% relevant. Yeah, 27 field tested, hands-on activities they have. And one of the main emphasis in this Growing Up Wild activity, but it's in all of P Wild, is this idea of social emotional development and recognizing emotions and how things make them feel and how they make choices based on those feelings. Like, you see a picture of a snake, how does that make you feel? And then you spend the week learning about snakes or spiders or things that everybody gets scared of, or bats. And then you learn, like, oh my gosh, they're like so important ecosystem components. And then by the end of the week, you might do that same activity and do like a graph where you graph everyone's emotions, and like sneaky math is happening. And by the end of the week, you learn that, like, oh, when you learn a little bit about a bat, you learn that like they're really important and I do like them now, I don't hate them. So it's a really neat way to recognize emotions and learn more information and then reassess those emotions. And it's also really cute because in every activity in Growing Up Wild, there's a snack idea that's like thematic to the actual activity. So, oh my gosh, what's a good example? Oh, classic example is there's a worm activity, and it's actually a really cute one because they like measure worms and they like use rulers and charts, and then and they're usually like gummy worms or something, but the snack is worms and dirt. And so like things that I would absolutely never think of, they think of for me and make me look better. So I appreciate that a lot. Let's see here. Is that it? That might be it, which would be great because then it would leave us time for questions, but it might not be it. Oh, no, it's not it yet. Here, let me keep going here. Bear with me. Can you still see, Katie, can you still see my screen?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Okay. So this is what I want to show you. I'm going to skip quick to Flying Wild, and then I'll take questions. Now, Flying Wild, as a non-formal educator, I've almost used this more than any other guide. And that's saying a lot because I use the other ones a lot. But Flying Wild was created really with the concept of global education, diverse cultures, and urban areas. Birds can be found everywhere, absolutely everywhere. There are no elk in New York City, but there are lots of birds in New York City, right? So like this, there's somehow you can connect to lots of people through birds. Also, because birds are often very global, different times of the year, you can have great diversity, even if you're in a place that might not be super rural or super wild. It also has a huge, strong component to different cultures because birds, their symbolism show up in so many cultures throughout the world. And it gives educators a really, really neat opportunity to connect with other educators in different parts of the world through the scaffolding of the lessons and learn from each other. So, like I know a teacher, a third grade teacher, whose students became pen pals with students in Costa Rica. And they'd be like, hey, have the goldfinches arrived yet? And then they would like, oh, by the way, this is what we eat this time of year because this is the celebration we have. And all of a sudden there's like the science and culture getting all melded together. And oops, they're also learning language arts and skills to write letters to each other. So this guide is very interdisciplinary with an emphasis on culture and global conservation. It's set up really differently though, and this is why I use it a lot. This guide, actually, the first third is set up for volunteer-led activities. So if we have a big wildlife festival for our department and we have 700 people that come that day, and there's like 2 educators in our department, we're going to need some help, right? So there's the whole first third is volunteer-led activities where you don't have to be a scientist to lead them. They're set up in a way, the materials for them are really great, that you can kind of set them up physically, get them, organized at your event. And then someone with like little to no experience could lead those activities for people roving or going through, even if it's more structured than that. And you have like a wildlife day with 500 sixth graders. You could have a volunteer lead a station and they don't have to be a bird biologist to do it. There are definitely teacher-led activities that are more classroom oriented. But again, lots of different people can lead those. And then the cool thing is there's this whole section for student-led activities. So if you work at a nature center or at a school where you want to really engage the community more in the work that you're doing, and just do like a community builder for no other reason but building community and a sense of place among people who live somewhere, you can have a big wildlife day or a bird festival day and kids can lead stations. And this guide gives you beautiful activities to do that. And all of the work has been done for you. You just have, not all, right? Like there are materials required, but it gives you a great outline to do a great program. With, again, lots of great science and math and other things being addressed. These are some examples of the activities. They're a lot like the other P-Wild, what you need, the time it takes to do it, maybe some vocab you should know, a little bit of background information, and then the procedures and an assessment section. Like Flying Wild especially is very physical, not in the sense that if you have participants who have some physical challenges, like if someone's in a wheelchair or something, you can still do most of these activities, if not all of them, but there's an opportunity to move in them and like move around from big places, like place to place over a big field. I do the Great Migration Challenge a lot, and like these kids actually become birds and they go on this migratory route. Sometimes they die dramatically and sometimes they don't. And so it's a really cool lesson, but a lot of them are very like, you get to move quite a bit, regardless of physical ability, you get to move in some way quite a bit. That was the end. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Theoretically, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then stop share. And then I'll take questions. If anyone has questions, you can raise your hand or write them out or whatever you'd like to do. Katie, help me out if you see somebody. Or just like, just talk if you want to.
Yeah, I would say I have a question, Ali, just out of curiosity. This looks like really awesome resources. How are you guys able to provide these for free? I think this is so cool that people can access this.
Yeah, so like not every state provides them for free, first of all.
Okay.
Like there are some states charge. The reason Vermont provides them for free, and most are very subsidized, if not free, is because some of it is state funded, just part of my state general fund I use towards this. But a lot of my guides are also at least half funded by what are called federal excise tax on hunting, fishing gear, called Pittman-Robertson and Dingell-Johnson excise tax. So long story short, people who hunt and fish and buy the gear for it and the license for it, there's an 11% tax on all of those expenditures. That 11% tax gets put back to the state by the Fish and Wildlife Service, which is a federal agency. They reallocate that tax back to the state to help support conservation programs. One of those programs for me is Project Wild. So when people, like, sometimes people are like, I can't believe state tax dollars is funding this. Mostly it's funded by hunters and anglers, honestly, and trappers. But there is state funds, and the state of Vermont, the legislators think that it matters, and so it can be part of the general fund.
Very cool. Thank you.
We do have another question. Is it necessary to have a training before implementing?
Some yes, some no. So like Project Wild, the terrestrial guide, the K through 12 terrestrial guide, and the aquatic wild guide, yes. Flying Wild recently became available for purchase. I think it's only in a PDF though. And there are some states that still have books. Like I still have a bunch of books, and I'll do a training and give them to people if they want me to do it. But I won't just send people books like for no charge. Like I will train them. But you, for a price, can buy Flying Wild, and for a price you can buy Growing Up Wild anywhere you live in the country. In Vermont, if you want to get trained in those, I'll give you the books free, but you got to bear with me for 4 hours, and then you'll get the books for free. There's also a book that you can buy that is just a PDF that's really amazing, called Science and Civics. And it's really good for like middle and high school levels. It's just a PDF, but it's a P. Wild Science and Civics book, and it's like pretty awesome. But there too, there's a purchase, and then it's a PDF. But everything, like, so it's a hodgepodge of what you can buy and what you have to get trained on.
Great. There was another question similar to that. How can I find out if they're free in their state or not?
Ask your state coordinator. Like if you go to the P. Wild website, there's a like get trained button, and then it will list out all the state coordinators, and it's a hyperlink to their contact. Just ask like, what does this cost? And for me, like, it's free, but I do require like you have 15 educators at the workshop. So because I don't want to go train 4 people for 4 hours. Like I've definitely done 50, but I don't want to do 5. So like every state's different how they do it, but definitely just connect with your state coordinator.
And I did put the links in the chat.
Cool.
So I think you can see those, and they can find their get trained button and figure that out.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Feel free to unmute or put in the chat. I know it takes a little bit of time to type, so we'll give people another minute.
Yeah.
I think we might be good. Any last questions for Allie and Project Wild?
Oh, there's a new message. Yep.
That was great. And
yeah,
we
well,
do have, and I just put in the chat the survey to fill out, because we have it after every session. So just go ahead and give us feedback with that survey. And Allie, that was awesome. I get the pleasure of being in the same state as Allie. And I got to finally see the presentation today, and that was awesome. I want to use it more. I feel like I don't use it enough.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time. Like I said, I've trained lots of people throughout this state, but we use it a ton in the Fish and Wildlife Department, and like a ton, and it's pretty magic. So I can't emphasize enough or encourage you enough, especially if you're into STEM. So thank you so much for your time.
That's awesome. Thank you, everyone. And there is another session at 1, and I think you have 3 to pick from. So go ahead and go on the website and figure out which one you want to go to. And thank you so much, Allie. That was awesome.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.